to our revisions. As you remember, last time we started with prompt. We had to write about a color. I established a rule, which was to have 14 lines, and title we left off because I didn't really know what the poem was about yet, so I couldn't title it. I have a feeling that this is going to be a longer video. The revision process of anything is actually the work, quote unquote, and it's also what takes the longest time, meaning to write 14 lines can take 5 minutes, it could take 2 minutes, it's really up to you as you get the flow. It might go really, really quick. So the revision is where you're going to spend most of your time, and I think that's sort of what you learn as you keep writing, that it's not the writing itself necessarily that's the time consuming aspect of it, it's the revisions. And revisions is where you get to really, really make something yours, because the unconscious mind is going to have the inspiration, but the revision, the technical brain, the conscious brain is going to be where you separate yourself and you make things whole and correct and really, really make sure that the inspiration has direction. So here we have a poem. It has 14 lines. I'm going to read it again quickly and we'll go straight into the idea of how I approach it now after I have something on paper, after I've thought about it and slept on it maybe and really considered. Sometimes revisions happen right away. You notice 30 seconds later, oh, I would have changed that word, I would change this comma, I would change something about the rules, something about the prompt, something about whatever. Sometimes you just write something and it's, to you, it just sits there and maybe you come back to it, maybe you don't. Obviously in this case we are going to come back to it. I think that there's always something to be gained, even if, quote unquote, the poem is not good or the piece is not good. There's technical aspects you can always work on, even if the inspiration is not sort of grabbing you. There is benefits to revisiting anything you write, even years later. There are many examples of people who write something now and then 5 years later they'll come back and they'll realize, oh, there was this spark here or there was something to take from there, and they can run with it. So here's the poem. We're going to read it first and then I'll get into the revision aspects of it and how I think about revision. And there's going to be a lot here again, so this might be a longer video. Blue laps at the skin on my arm. It touches the hair, moving them. They wriggle like caterpillars climbing. It is often that they move forward, biting, chewing, swallowing, wondering where their next meal might come from. Do they worry that they may never eat again? Probably not. Instead, the focus is only on the next meal because their stomach rumbles until it hurts to move. Much like my arm taped to my side, it is not the lack of function that bothers them, but the impending explosion of house arrest leading to the next life. So that's the poem. It's kind of, to me, as I read it back and I hear it out loud, again, always read your poems out loud when you're revising, just to hear it, because again, it's really an auditory art, not a written art. It's only written down once paper becomes available and all that kind of stuff, but originally poetry is something to be spoken and remembered through sound and experienced through sound. So definitely read them out loud. And as I'm reading it, it feels very staccato. It feels very one hit, next hit, beat, 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 which is not really where I want to be. I want it to be smoother. I want it to sort of flow. And that might be set up by the color choice, right? Blue and the fact that we're thinking about water and all that kind of stuff. But I think also just in general, music, we don't think of music necessarily as staccato. We think of it as cohesive, and cohesive implies some sort of flow. Though there are obviously staccato beats and staccato portions to music, really we want to think of it as staccato with intention rather than staccato of brains working. And so yesterday when I was writing the poem, obviously I was talking out loud, so there was a lot of more staccato because my brain is working on two wavelengths, which is writing the poem in a creative manner and then also explaining what I'm doing technically. So I'm not blaming myself for, sometimes that happens. You're trying to work through something and it becomes much more brain work than inspiration, and that will happen on a regular basis, and that's fine. But as I read it now, that is very, very apparent to me. And so we want to see how we can smooth out sort of these beats. So when I'm writing a poem, as I've argued in other videos, I think it's good to keep versions and to see how you're progressing. And sometimes things in older versions will rehash themselves in newer versions, or you can even take from your older version and put it into a new version if you think it works better. It just sort of helps the brain process the information and keep yourself on task and aware of what's going on. So I have copied this poem. I'm going to paste it above it. You can order it above, below. You'll see things disappear as we keep going. Unfortunately, it's impossible to keep all of it present, but hopefully you remember the prompts and the rules as we're going. I like to keep it above. It just sort of focuses it right in the center as I'm working and allows me to focus on that piece rather than thinking of it as below. It just keeps it in the same space at all times, and that's why I like to copy and paste above. But again, preference up to you. So we were talking yesterday about colors. Blue is a very, very general color. It's a little bit too general, I think. I did actually look up different types of blues to see which one resonated with me. There's a lot of overlap between music and art, like painting or drawing, that you'll see within poetry. I think all art relates to each other, and so you'll see, color, all the sensory stuff will happen, and so having a general knowledge of other art or science or really anything, right? All knowledge is sort of intertwined. So in this case, we're dealing with the color, so the art world sort of creeps up in my head, and so blue is not, there is a color blue, right? We know that if you're thinking about computers, right, every color has a designation that the computer understands in order to which blue are you supposed to prompt and which blue are you supposed to have on the screen. So there is a color blue, it has a code. I think it's a little general for me here, and I think when you choose your blue, it also changes the diction you'll use. And so I actually thought the blue cobalt resonated with me when I was looking at the color and when I was thinking about what kind of feel. So, for example, there's sky blue, but sky blue implies a little bit too much happiness. If you remember, we're talking sort of about angst or anger or sadness here. So something bright and cheery is not going to work. So cobalt has a rough sort of metallic feel to it. Maybe not rough, maybe just metallic. And so that sort of allows for that distance, that anxiety, that sadness to creep in a little more from the get-go rather than blue. Blue is just a little too general. Cobalt has more texture and flavor, and so we're going to go with cobalt. And so once I get to cobalt, the next word, lapse, sort of doesn't work as well because lapse implies waves, which are more blue-green, whereas cobalt is more blue-gray. And so to me, I have to now start changing things as one change leads to another change. One good deed leads to another, right? That all sort of intertwines here where you start tinkering with one thing and of course it opens up hundreds of new possibilities for the next thing. So I don't think lapse works anymore. I think cobalt grasps is much better. It's more tactile. It's more forceful. It goes with that metallic sort of coldness, right? A grasp is different than a lap. A lap is much more like a kiss. It's much more gentle. It's much more intimate in a weird way. And so here we're trying to, again, create that distance, that sort of detached nature that sadness or depression or things of that nature might have. So cobalt grasps at the skin on my arm, and it touches. We don't really need to follow grammar here. We don't need to think about grammatical rules in a traditional sense, but we also want to think about how grammar changes the way a verb works, right? A verb can be active, passive. Nowadays it's out of fashion completely to write in the passive voice. And so I am a student of that. I agree that most times I think active is better than passive, especially with poetry, because honestly, you want the poem to move. You want the people to continue down the page, continue listening, continue coming with you. And so it touches seems very passive to me. And just a quick fix, touching, the hair moving them, right? It touches to touching makes the cobalt much more active in this poem. So cobalt grasps with the skin of my arm, touching the hair. And instead of the hair, I say touching its hair, right? Again, we're thinking about my arm. And so, again, we're trying to create more flow and more connection between everything in the poem. And so when we say the hair, it's sort of, again, a little more removed. Touching its hair ties it back to my arm. So cobalt grasps at the skin on my arm, touching its hair. You know what? I'm going to change all of that. So cobalt grasps. So we can really, again, you'll see that as you're revising, I don't know why I said that, revising, right? That you can change everything. And even if it changes your lines length, even if it changes the prompt, that's okay. Again, because the prompt and the rule is just to open it up for you. So we can manipulate, we can completely change all the rules as we're going. And that's the fun of it, really, if you think about it, that you have this canvas now that's not blank, it's now existent, and now you get to chip away, right, at what is going on. So cobalt grasps, we can change it and make it much more clear, grasps, my arm hair, pulling. Actually, you know what? Cobalt grasps my arm hair. Now I'm thinking about it because I'm a little lost here, right? All of a sudden, we've changed completely the verb, and we've changed the way that the arm hair interacts now with the blue. And I have to think to myself, is that better or worse? So when it was laps, right, when cobalt laps at my arm, the hair moves. Whereas if you're grasping, it's not moving on its own free will anymore. We've now changed that aspect of it. And do I like that, right? Or are we trying to have that floaty sort of reactive way towards the cobalt? So is the cobalt taking the charge, or is it there and things react to it, and neither of them is really having too much agency? So let's try with just the active and see how that changes things, and then of course we can go back to the passive and see if that makes it more sort of docile or flowy in our heads. So cobalt grasps my arm hair, wriggling, right? Again, we're changing our verbiage, so we have to change the verb here as well. Cobalt grasps my arm hair, wriggling, like caterpillars climbing. And then I would change it is often, because again, it sounds a little formal, it sounds a little stilted. So cobalt grasps my arm hair, wriggling it like caterpillars climbing, and then I can really just completely cut this forward, and I might insert M dash, and of course Microsoft Word has to do it that way, because everything here has now become a lot more active, and everything here sort of has to work grammatically in a general sense that it, right, if the whole point here is not to draw the reader out of the poem, and anytime something sounds strange, grammatically, or even the sounds of it sound weird, right? Made up words can do that. Sonically, that's the word I'm looking for. If it sounds sonically strange, that also can drag somebody out, right? It removes them from the experience. And so you want to make it as experiential and easy to follow as possible. So cobalt grasps my arm hair, wriggling it like caterpillars climbing forward, biting, chewing, swallowing. Again, we're in that staccato right here. And I don't mind it as much here because it just sort of pauses as you see the caterpillar move, right? It creates this sense of stilted movement. And so whereas before it felt stilted when we started, I actually want it to feel smooth because we're talking about sort of a watery feel, so you want that smoothness, whereas here we're talking about an animal moving, and it might move in a very stilted way, which implies growth as well. So we have cobalt grasps my arm hair, wriggling like caterpillars climbing forward, biting, chewing, swallowing. And you'll see I moved wondering to the next line. There's two reasons for that. One is, another kind of general guideline is if you look at your margins here, I guess it's an OCD. I like margins that sort of work together, that sort of look cohesive, right? You'll see right here, right now, this line is very, very far out. And all of a sudden, when you're reading it on the page, this is a visual thing, it drags you that way. And so you want that to be intentional. You want that drag to be from a conscious place, not an unconscious, I don't know, the line just went really long, right? So for me, it makes sense that when I'm seeing the word wondering sticking out, for example, here, it drags my eye. And so that kind of pulls me out when I'm reading, personally. Again, there's no comma here, and so we can talk about line break itself, right? Lines can be used for pauses, they can be used to change ideas. Here I'm using it sort of as a comma, so I don't need this comma. And again, grammatically it might work, but I'm choosing not to have it because I think the line break does the job. I also think that wondering is different than the other. These are very, very physical actions, right? Biting, chewing, swallowing, whereas wondering is an existential mind thing. And so it doesn't fall into that category of action. And so I have it without the comma to sort of imply it's overarching. And again, we're going to have to deal with this line overhang here, but we'll get there in a second. So wondering where their next meal might come from. And so the question is, might come from is clunky. It just feels clunky, right? It's just a lot of words. And the question is, how do I make that smaller? How do I make that shorter? And the answer is, I'm not sure yet. I'm going to leave it for now because it hasn't come to me, but I do want to address this, and I'll bold it, just it, so that it will prompt me again to come back and think about might come from and how to change that. So, cobalt grasps my arm here, wriggling it like caterpillars, climbing forward. Wriggling it like caterpillars, climbing forward. Biting, chewing, swallowing, wondering where their next meal might come from. Do they worry that they may never eat again? Again, we've talked about questions in the last video where we were thinking about, do we like rhetorical questions, do we not? And so, as I'm not a fan of rhetorical questions, we can change this whole line to they don't worry where they don't worry, period, or comma, up to you how much of a break you want to put there, right? We think of periods as full stops, we think of comma as half stop, we think of line break as whatever stop might work in that place. We don't have a general rule about line stops, but commas and periods, I like to think of musical notes rather than grammatical necessities. So for me, a comma is a half stop, period is a full stop, M dash, which I have up here, sort of implies keep going like a colon might, right? It's connected, but it's different. And so I'm using my grammar here to imply full stop. They don't worry. Instead, they focus on, right? Again, I'm trying to remove the type of language that implies break here because we're into action already. We're into biting, chewing, swallowing, wondering. So instead they focus on is a much more active way of saying it instead of the focus is only on the next meal. It seems very, very passive. It removes the caterpillar from the action of focusing. So they focus on the next meal. And so now I'm starting to see a problem, right? We have their next meal, they're wondering about their next meal, but they're also focusing on their next meal. So there's this weird internal conflict coming up here, and I'm not sure that it's going to work where we're thinking about they're wondering about their next meal, but they're also focused on their next meal, and I have to sort of deal with that, especially within such a small proximity of space, right? It's just one line in the middle, and so I want to think about that as well. Instead, they focus on the next meal because their stomach rumbles until it hurts to move. Much like my arm taped to my side, it is not the lack of function. It is again formal, and it doesn't really sound like my voice. It doesn't really sound like me. It doesn't sound like modern writing. It is when you're not using conjunctions, it injects pause and space. And so you want to think about how do you want it to sound. It is implies more space and implies maybe thinking about something. So I don't want that here. I want it to sound more natural. I want it to sound more like movement. And so I'm going to make it a conjunction. It's not the lack of function that bothers them, but the impending explosion of house arrest leading to the next life. And I don't like the word the next life. I think their next life, again, makes ownership there. Something we've lost is that blue. And when I'm thinking of caterpillars, obviously we're talking about butterflies here, right? The next life being when they emerge as a butterfly. And I think we can bring that color back, blue, and really, really hone in on that prompt about writing about a color. And so I'm going to think about that as well. How do I get blue here? Or how do I get the cobalt back? Or how do I get colors in general back, right? And so we're going to read it again and think and see how we can go from here to the next version. And to be honest, you can edit each version, this one infinitely, but I actually like to, again, add my version, and then we go again so that I sort of see how I'm progressing through, and I can focus, not worry about, am I going to lose an idea? Am I going to not have an idea? It just exists right here. And so I can always look back and say, oh, this idea worked, this idea didn't work. So cobalt grasps my arm hair, wriggling it like caterpillars climbing forward, biting, chewing, swallowing, wondering where their next meal might come from. They don't worry. And so again, this really doesn't work because the wondering and they don't worry don't go together. Either they're wondering or they worry, but they can't do both, right? Because one implies hope and one implies not hope. And so A and not A can't go together. It's logically incoherent. And so I have to think, how do I alleviate that? Do I like the idea of hope, wondering, or do I want them to not worry? I don't know. I guess that's not true, right? Worry itself, something here is just not working because there's just too much about this focus, this brain going on here, and I'm trying to be too clever. They're doing this, but they're not doing that, but they're doing this. It's just a little confusing. So I have to rethink this whole thing. And what am I trying to say here is really the question, right? What was I trying to accomplish? What was my brain trying to imply by creating this yes, but no, but yes, right? It's indecision. I kind of like the wondering. It goes with the biting, chewing, swallowing. So I'm going to take out this they don't worry. And I might just take it all out, to be honest. And we'll bring this up, and it's becoming a much smaller poem. You'll see we started with 14 lines, and to be honest, I think I'm going to try and get back to the 14 lines, but the ideas might have to come in a roundabout way where we cut first and add later when our brain kicks in on the theme, and as we see it sort of take shape. That's the beauty here of like writing instead of marble, right? You can always add back. You don't. The trick with sculpting, right, is you can only take away, but here we can take away, we can add back, we can manipulate. It's a more free process. So cobalt grasps my arm hair, wriggling. Let's take out the it. The it puts in too much of a pause. Cobalt grasps my arm hair, wriggling like caterpillars climbing forward. So the cobalt is now taking sort of possession of the arm, and the arm was doing its own action of wriggling. So now we've completely changed. It's not the thing that's moving the arm hair. The arm hair is moving on its own, and it grasps. And now we sort of feel a pull, a tug, rather than a lackadaisical floating. So cobalt grasps my arm hair, wriggling like caterpillars climbing forward, biting, chewing, swallowing, wondering where their next meal might be instead of come from. Because I think come from implies, again, passivity, whereas might be is we're looking for it, we're not sure. It just implies a little more not knowing rather than looking and searching. Wondering biting, chewing, swallowing, wondering where their next meal might be because their stomach rumbles. So again, we're talking about arm hair that's wriggling. It should be stomachs rumble, each hair. Because their stomachs rumble. And again, we're talking about line length here. This one juts out a whole bunch. So I want to think about how I can make this line work in a more narrow, literally, physically narrow way. And because their stomachs rumble or stomach rumbles? Because their stomachs rumble until it hurts, right? And again, to move is a qualifier on the hurts, but it's also a little bit of a cliche, right? It hurts to move is a cliche. So I can just take it out, right? I don't have to fix it. Sometimes the answer is elision and deleting, right? Like sculptures, you just take it away and then it works. So cobalt grasps my arm hair, wriggling like caterpillars, climbing forward, biting, chewing, swallowing, wondering where their next meal might be. Because their stomachs rumble until it hurts. Much like my arm taped to my side, it's not the lack of function that bothers them, but the impending explosion of house arrest leading to their next life. So it actually is a much more cohesive poem at this point. There is a little bit of weirdness here I'm finding as I'm writing it because grammatically it does seem a little, there's no pause, right? So we just keep going and it feels a lot. It feels like one breath. On the other hand, there is a complete parallel here, right? I've created this dual, one image of the cobalt, and so now I've actually created a much more cohesive image than I had before. Right before we were worried about 3 or 4 images coming at you, and here it's kind of one image, which is the cobalt grasping the arm hair, wriggling like caterpillars. And what the caterpillars are doing. So it's one image, this caterpillar grasp thing, and then all of a sudden I have a metaphor here, or a simile really, right? Much like, so the like here, simile, that explodes that image into a cognitive sort of experience. So here we have a physical experience, a mentally physical experience, right? It's obviously, you're not physically experienced, but you're sort of experiencing it through your own arm and its hair. And then here we have sort of the explanation of the experience through the cognitive methods of language. So cobalt grasps my arm hair, wriggling like caterpillars, climbing forward, biting, chewing, swallowing, wondering where their next meal might be because their stomachs rumble until it hurts. Much like my arm taped to my side, it's not the lack of function that bothers them, but the impending explosion of house arrest leading to their next life. So again, I wanted to think about how I can get color in. I also want to think about now, as I'm reading it, we'll have our next version here, that right here, the arm taped to my side doesn't really work. It works as an image, but it doesn't necessarily cohede. It doesn't necessarily tie into, I think cohede's a word. Something's cohesive, it cohedes. I don't know. Somebody, again, will have to check me on that. It doesn't tie into the idea of rumbling stomachs, right? Because now we move from stomach to arm. So again, we have this problem of multiple images instead of one cohesive sort of idea. So the question is, if the stomach is rumbling, what's the sort of what's the way that we can tie back to the stomach and its inability to process, so that it again creates a much more cohesive image throughout the poem. So, cobalt grasps my arm hair, wriggling like caterpillars, climbing forward. Climbing forward. I actually think I'm going to elongate this line because I don't think the pause there is working for me. Every time I read it, and this is the benefit of reading it, right? That pause feels unnatural. And then I can take out this M dash and I'll start a new line. So, cobalt grasps my arm hair, wriggling like caterpillars, climbing forward, biting, chewing, swallowing, and then I might put wondering up here. And that might help my grammar issue or my sort of non-pause. And I might have to add that comma back that we were talking about. And you'll see here, as I keep going, that I'm tinkering, that every little comma and period matters, every line break matters. And to me, that's what's beautiful about poetry. That's what keeps poetry interesting to me, is that there are literally infinite ways to do this. And so what works is when you hear it and it feels like it's done to you, that's when you know it's working. It's not about the grammar, right? It's not about, is the comma in the right place grammatically? It's, does that comma accomplish what I want it to accomplish? And so that's the beauty, right? You have to be obsessed with the language. You have to be obsessed with the punctuation. It's just everything has to come together. And to me, that's the obsessive nature over each little detail like that is what makes you a poet. So we were talking yesterday about how to define what makes you a writer, et cetera, et cetera. And to me, what makes you that is the obsession over the craft of it, right? Over the workings of it, the inner workings, how something works grammatically, how something works sonically, how something works on the page visually, right? Every sort of faculty you have is brought to this piece of work, and that's what makes you the artist. That's what makes you the poet, because you are obsessed with the art of it. So cobalt grasps my arm hair, wriggling like caterpillars, climbing forward, biting, chewing, swallowing, wondering where their next meal might be, because their stomach rumbles. And I actually don't like that because here. I think there needs to be a pause. And so wondering where this might work. And you see all of a sudden now my rule about lines at the end of, the sort of all the ends of the lines lining up is kind of coming to fruition as I sort of tinker with the grammar, with the way we pause, the way we think about how the language is working. And so that kind of, it reinforces that rule to me in my head. Again, this is, it's confirmation bias, but to me, it just works. Something about sort of focusing even on the visual aspect of the poem, right? There are poems that are completely visual, right? Poems that make up pictures, poems where people use the same word over and over, but they create, it's like pointillism, right? You can create images with just a word. You can create, in a religious sense, right? There are a lot of religious paintings where an object will be created with the verses of Torah or the verses of Psalms, right? And you can see it's just to sort of enact the part of the story through the visual representation of the story, with the language, right, making the visual representation, that works. So here I like to think of visuals as well, and I'm going to keep my rules sort of intact here of, it's not exact, right? There's flow between the end of the lines, but you can sort of see a cohesive unit being created. So cobalt grasps my arm hair, wriggling like caterpillars, climbing forward, biting, chewing, swallowing, wondering where their next meal might be, because their stomachs rumble. You know what? I'm going to take it. Something about the stomachs rumble. There's too many S's going on, so I'm gonna make it singular. And arm hair will be a singular, not a plural. We're not going to worry about each individual hair. We're going to worry about it as a whole. So their stomach rumbles until it hurts. Or I guess it's because no, it doesn't work, right? Because caterpillar is a single. So we can change that. Cobalt grasps my arm hair, wriggling like a caterpillar. And so again, grammar does come in. It's still English that I'm working with, so we're still going to worry about that. Because again, we still want it to work as much as we can with grammar and with the rules of English. And so here we go. Cobalt grasps my arm hair, wriggling like a caterpillar, climbing forward, biting, chewing, swallowing, wondering where their next meal might come. Where its next meal, I guess we're going to change that again because it's one caterpillar. Where its next meal might be, because its stomach rumbles until it hurts, much like my arm taped to my side. And again, we have to change this arm taped to my side. What would cause a stomach to rumble but also not work, right? What closes a stomach? Much like So this is, again, a cliche, but I'm trying to get somewhere. And fear is what holds the stomach, right? We feel the fear grasp our stomach, right? And that sort of pauses us, that sort of gives us that double over feeling. And so we're going to allow that to sit for right now, just so it holds the place of what the original image we're going to come up with. I just want to see it in its whole. So Cobalt grasps my arm, hair, wriggling like a caterpillar climbing forward, biting, chewing, swallowing, wondering where its next meal might be because its stomach rumbles until it hurts. Much like the clamp of fear, it's not the lack of function. And so that we've now changed that lack of function, so we have to come back. It's not the lack of function that bothers them, that bothers him, right? We're anthropomorphizing that caterpillar. It's not the lack of function, and because I identify as male, we're going to make it a him. It's not the lack of function that bothers him, but the impending explosion of house arrest leading to his next life. Now, this doesn't make any sense to me again, but the impending explosion of house arrest leading to his next life. Explosion of house arrest? No. House arrest is not an explosive thing. House arrest is an implosive thing, right? You're stuck somewhere. So I might even have to move this house arrest somewhere else. So again, we're going to take this. Rumbles until it hurts, much like the clamp of, let's try house arrest here. I like that image. Something about it is resonating with me. Obviously the caterpillar, right? It cocoons itself. So I just like it. And we're going to move it here and see how maybe I can bring in color now that I've moved house arrest up to here. I might be able to move that color back in here. So Cobalt grasps my arm hair, wriggling like a caterpillar climbing forward, biting, chewing, swallowing, wondering where its next meal might be, because its stomach rumbles until it hurts. Much like the clamp of house arrest, it's not the lack of function that bothers him, but the impending explosion of color blossoming into a new life. And so now we've actually sort of changed completely. We went from cobalt and coldness to blossoming and color, which actually implies a movement, right? It's the house arrest that leads to this new life of happiness. And I'm not sure if it works, right? So far we have sadness, and there's a sadness here, but all of a sudden it becomes happy. And I don't like the way that it goes, because I don't actually think that that's the emotion that's being played out here. So again, we're going to keep going. And so far we have, let's see how many, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 versions so far. And you might get, hundreds. As long as it keeps working, as long as you feel in your head that you're not done yet, you can keep going infinitely. And we're going to try maybe one more version, and then that'll probably be it. Or maybe we'll keep going until I feel it's complete. Let's see. That's part of the excitement. This is the new version. So Cobalt grasped my arm hair, rigging, and you'll see this is a short line, whereas everything else seems a little longer, and this one is short again at the end. And I didn't design that, but sometimes you create sort of like a structure, like a cathedral structure. And again, I don't want to read too much into it, because, again, the words and the message drive the poem, not the function. But you can see that it sort of has this chiastic almost, right? Small, long, short, shortest, back out to the long, back to the short. And so I'm not saying that was necessarily intentional. It wasn't. I'm going to say it wasn't intentional, but there is something nice to having uniformity, or the idea of uniformity, and you can see how well it worked out, right? 3 short lines, beginning, middle, end, and then sort of a tapering and equality there that I was not intending for at all. But it's nice when it works out that way. Excuse me. So Cobalt grasped my arm hair, wriggling like a caterpillar climbing forward, biting, chewing, swallowing, wondering where its next meal might be, because its stomach rumbles until it hurts. Much like the clamp of house arrest, it's not the lack of function that bothers. I don't think lack of function here works, because we're worried about the future. It's not the lack of direction, right? That's what we're worried about. That bothers him, but the impending implosion, I think, right? We're going inwards, not outwards. So explosion wouldn't work. Impending implosion of color, ending his old life, right? So now we've done our work of thinking of color. Again, we've brought in color, but instead of making color happy, we're talking about implosion of color. And I might even change it to color to gray, or something along those lines, right? Let me leave it here, and then we'll do a new version. Ending his old life, because they don't know that, right? We were talking about in our last video that caterpillars probably don't know that they're going to be reborn. And to be honest, humans don't even know what comes after death. So I think that there is something there to be said about how this sort of action and hope is still mired in sadness and tragedy and not knowing. So we're going to try here maybe changing that color, and this is probably going to be our last version for now, because I think it actually is much more cohesive. It flows much better. It has the color in it from the prompt. It's not 14 lines anymore, but you know what? You have to break your own rules. That's the way it goes. And it sort of captures an emotional resonance that I think works. So Cobalt grasps my arm hair, wriggling like a caterpillar climbing forward, biting, chewing, swallowing, wondering where its next meal might be because its stomach rumbles until it hurts. Much like the clamp of house arrest, it's not the lack of direction that bothers him, but the impending implosion of color, ending his old life. That to me sounds really, really good, actually. Again, this is a taste thing, so maybe not. And the last thing that we got to do before we sort of quote-unquote finish this revision is think of a title. And so I like to underline my titles. Different people like to do it differently. Titles can be part of the poem. Titles can be one word. It can be the first line of a poem. It's really up to you. For me, I think a title here sort of encapsulate what's going on here. Works. And for me, I underline my titles. Different people do it differently. And so to me, I have to think in my head now, as we're talking about, titles are really, really hard because titles sort of introduce the reader and they sort of encapsulate the whole idea that the theme that you're about to get into. So here we're talking about ending life, the implosion of color, being pulled forward while sort of acting, right? Biting, chewing, swallowing, that's sort of living itself, right? In an enactment of a life itself. So what would be the appropriate title here of sort of, maybe not fully doom, right? There is a hope for rebirth. As the writer, I do know that a caterpillar is going to become a butterfly, so there is that hope, built in while we are thinking about it. So there is that hope built in while we're thinking about it. But we want to think about also, okay, there's a sadness because a lot of sort of misery or difficult things have to happen while we're waiting for the next life. So how do I get that into a title? It's a really good question. And there's something about this implosion of color. When I changed it from explosion to implosion of color, it really, really brought it home for me. And I might change the color to implosion of gray, to be honest. Something about that gray ties back to our cobalt and allows for a much more sort of lack of color, right? Gray is sort of the absence of all colors, and almost the word, right? When we think of gray, we think of depression, to be honest. And so I'm using my color theory here. And I really like this line. And so I'm going to do a simple thing, and I think I'm going to make that my title, to be honest. And we're going to call it Implosion of Gray. So we're going to have Implosion of Gray. And you probably hear some banging going on. Sorry about that. So we're going to do Implosion of Gray, and that's going to title my poem. And so I'm going to read it back one more time with the title, because I think as poets, oftentimes people don't read their titles when they're reading their poems, and I think that's a mistake, right? Think of the title as part of the poem, as part of the story, as part of whatever you're writing. I think it really is a part. So it should be read out loud when you're reading the poem. Implosion of Gray. Cobalt grasps my arm hair, wriggling like a caterpillar climbing forward, biting, chewing, swallowing, wondering where its next meal might be because its stomach rumbles until it hurts. Much like the clamp of house arrest, it's not the lack of direction that bothers him, but the impending implosion of Gray, ending his old life. And to me, that all works together. And that implosion of Gray is actually, surprisingly, what's going to be the axiom around which the poem revolves. And so that's why it works as the title. Something to be said here is be because, of course, we have, the rhyme of be and be, but also because always implies something next. So it draws the reader automatically forward. And I just wanted to point that out, which I had not done before, which is when you use a word like because at the end of a line, it automatically ties the next line to it. So it's not just the enjambment of it, right? The lack of punctuation, that kind of thing. It's also the word itself, the diction. And so that creates a really, really strong push forward. And as this is about halfway through the poem, it helps get the reader to the next stage, to the end of the poem, to the turn, to the realization. And to me, what's fun about this implosion of Gray, or what's interesting about it, is that it sort of explains to you what is so scary about what comes next, right? It's not that necessarily things end, it's just more that there's almost an unknowable end, or a sort of sad end to it, right? That it's gray, that it kind of encapsulates you and keeps you under that house arrest. It sort of implodes upon you. And to me, that sort of is the feeling that many people have and that I've had as something ends and you sort of move to the next thing, that it's not that we don't know that something's next. It's that something has to sort of constrict you or die or hold you up first. And that pain is what may lead to the next thing. And so that, to me, that just works here as an image. And so that's going to be it for the revisions. You'll see, I think, how many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. This is the 7th version of the poem. And again, you could have gone a completely different direction if you wanted the cobalt to be more active, right? Cobalt grasps my arm hair. Or if you want it to be more passive. That's what I mean. More passive, right? Where blue laps at the skin, where that was passive. You could have gone with that image and created a completely different poem. But for me, something about the active, the action, it being inevitable, right? It's always moving forward. That's sort of what made my spidey senses, quote unquote, perk up. And so that's why I kept with it. So if you enjoyed that, hopefully it inspires you to keep writing, to tinker and perfect. And hopefully I get to read your poems either below or you'll submit them to us at the Jewish Literary Journal. If you enjoyed this video, please rate, share, and subscribe. And hopefully I'll see you in the next one.